Hello everyone, I thought we would do something a little bit different today. I wanted to take a look at a video that YouTube suggested to me from a channel called Debunked History. This video was entitled, White Slaves and Black, How the Transatlantic Slave Trade Racket is Worked. I thought it would be, let's say, interesting if we took a look at this together today.
Video, we looked at some of the conditions endured by white slaves in the 16th, 17th and 18th century in North Africa and found that they were just as dreadful as those endured by black slaves in North America and the Caribbean. If the transatlantic slave trade, which is sometimes known as a triangular trade, if the conditions weren't worse than those for white slaves, perhaps there were more of them, perhaps the numbers were more extensive, and it is this which makes the transatlantic slave trade uniquely awful.
Yeah, it's the numbers that make it uniquely awful. So let's take a look at his argument for a moment here. His first point is that slavery existed everywhere, and that everywhere it was terrible. So these two main points are that slavery is universal, and that it is also equivalent. He further demonstrates this equivalency by saying that it must be the numbers of slaves that makes it more extensive.
The first thing to remember when we think about slavery, and it's easy to forget this, is that slavery has been around for the whole of recorded history. The first record we have of slavery is some of the earliest written records.
He's making the same point again, so I'm just going to skip forward.
So I want to think about that a little today. Before we do that, I might mention why we call it the triangular trade. Ships used to take slaves from...
So this is an interesting part of the video here, because it seems that he assumes the viewer has absolutely no foreknowledge of even the transatlantic slave trade, which you'll see later kind of doesn't make sense with the rest of his assumptions.
Recently put a comment on one of my videos and said that there was never any slavery in California. That's ridiculous. What they meant by that was that there were no black slaves. There was no association with the transatlantic slave trade. The First Nation tribes in America were enthusiastic slavers long before white people arrived.
Okay, so to this point here, his general point that First Nation tribes, like if you include every tribe that exists, had slavery everywhere is, I guess, technically true. But let's take his point, was there slavery in California before the Spanish or Europeans, quote-unquote, white men arrived? Let's take a look at an excerpt from the Handbook of American Indians North of Mexico, Bureau of American Ethnology, Government Printing Office, published 1906. Beginning with the Tlingit, which is a tribe in Alaska, slavery as an institution existed among all the Northwest Coast Indians as far as California. It practically ceased with South Oregon. So this is saying the tribes up in Alaska coming down south to the southern part of Oregon had slavery, but starting with California, they didn't. So we don't really have evidence of slavery in California before the Europeans arrived, but we do have quite a bit of evidence of slavery after the Europeans arrived. This is often referred to as the other slavery. There's a famous book about it by Andres Resendez. This is similar to the situation that arises in Africa. Basically, under similar pressure from European forces, tribes in North America began pushing into the interior of the continent, capturing people and bringing them to be used in slavery under the Europeans.
The other curious thing about slavery is there's never been any suggestion until relatively recently that it was wrong. I mean, theft and murder have been fairly common practices, but everybody acknowledged that theft and murder are bad things to do. There have been prohibitions on them. There's been no such prohibitions against slavery until, well, the end of the 18th century, really. It's just been one of those things.
And then he just leaves that there. He doesn't follow it up with any kind of moral judgment or obviously slavery is bad. Good thing we figured that out. He just keeps going.
To see whether or not the transatlantic slave trade, the triangular trade, was uniquely awful, we really need to look at a few other types of slave trade and compare them.
Here we go, guys. Finally gonna get to concrete evidence.
Because it's so common, because slavery exists in every culture throughout the whole of recorded history, it means you're going to see it wherever you look. Whichever century you choose or whichever culture you choose, you'll see slavery there.
Just like in California.
What's happened with the transatlantic slave trade is a little bit like a magic trick. Some of you might have seen the 3 card trick.
Okay, I'll save you 3 minutes of your life. He's talking about the shell game.
Else is happening. That's what it's like with the transatlantic slave trade, really. We're always directed to look at that, to look at West Africa, the Atlantic, the Caribbean, and the United States of America, and in particular times, the 18th and 19th century. And because of that, that's the sort of slavery we see.
So this part is kind of confusing to me because earlier it seemed like he assumed we didn't even know what this transatlantic slave trade was since he had to explain it. And now he's like, that's the only thing anyone knows about. But other than that, what is his overall point? That Westerners are interested in the slave trade that they had a lot to do with and that happened relatively recently? I feel like that doesn't require a nefarious plot to explain. Another confusing thing is he arguing that we need more world history and multicultural history? I feel like this type of person doesn't agree with that.
Which is why we called it the slave trade. If we look elsewhere, and if we look at different times, we're going to see other slavery. Some of it will be worse, some of it will be better than the transatlantic slave trade.
Okay, and what is your point?
That's what I want to do in this little video now. So if we were to look at Europe in, I don't know, the 2nd or 3rd century, if we looked at Africa not in the 18th century but the 19th century, we might start seeing some other interesting things, and then we'll be able to compare them with the transatlantic slave trade and see whether there's any real difference.
Sorry, I was wrong. Now we're actually going to get some evidence.
Those pictures aren't from the Atlantic slave trade at all. They're from the Roman Empire. I thought we might look at the Roman Empire in the 2nd century AD, and particularly looking at Europe. Now, the Roman Empire covered a huge area at that time. All of Southern Europe, Western Europe, Eastern Europe, right up into Russia and the Ukraine, along through Turkey. And of those people, about 1 in 6 or 1 in 7 were slaves, which meant that at its height, the Roman Empire had 10 million slaves, which, by the way, compares in most interesting way with North America at the time of the American Civil War, where there were only 3 million slaves. Okay, the interesting thing now is that in North America, slaves had a fairly decent life expectancy for the time.
Oh, here we go. Now he's warming up.
A slave on a southern plantation might reasonably expect to live to late 30s. This meant that they had children, they were effectively breeding, they were producing new slaves. The slave population could be maintained without importing other slaves, so their children were born into slavery and became slaves as well. It didn't happen in the Roman Empire for the simple reason that the life expectancy of a Roman slave was 17 years of age. There was no time for them to breed, to have children that would become slaves.
Wait, so that's all he's gonna say about the difference between Rome and American slavery?
All the slaves had to be imported from outside, and that meant that every year the Roman Empire needed to get hold of 500,000 slaves. They came almost always from Northern Europe, from outside the Roman Empire, from Germany, Scandinavia, parts of Russia and so on. And they nearly always come from Northern Europe. There's been 1 or 2 Berbers, but apart from that, there are no black people, no black slaves.
Oh, don't worry, guys. The Romans didn't even enslave black people. Don't worry about it.
If we have 500,000 slaves seized each year and traded, that would give us, well, in 25 years, that would give us 12.5 million slaves. Now, this is interesting because the 12.5 million slaves that people often mention in connection with the Atlantic slave trade, they were transported across the Atlantic over the course of 250 or 300 years. The Roman Empire was dealing in that number of slaves in just 25 years. In other words, it was 10 times as extensive as the transatlantic slave trade, which is very curious indeed, really.
Okay, let's talk about that for a moment. There's a few more things involved in comparing Roman slavery to American slavery than just how many people they enslaved and from where exactly. The Romans didn't have the same ideas that we have about race and society, and they didn't have the same ideas about self. As Marcel Mauss writes, in Roman times the persona generally became synonymous with the true nature of the individual, but the slave was excluded from it. Quote, servus non habet personam, meaning a slave has no persona. This means he has no personality, he does not own his body, he has no ancestors, no name, no cognomen, no goods of his own. So you couldn't inherit being a slave, for example. But this idea affected Roman slavery in another way. They had something called manumissum, which was a practice through which slaves could earn or purchase their freedom. Of course, not all slaves would. Many would die by the abuses of the slavery they were in, but it's still a major difference when you're not inheriting slavery and you have some hope of getting out of it. In Roman society, you became a slave because of outside forces, debt, warfare, etc., and this marked you as a particular social class. But this idea would also have other interesting effects. So let's take a look at one more effect of this idea on Roman slavery. A Roman slave on formal manumissum was granted Roman citizenship and thereby formally integrated into Roman society. That's something that black people just could never do in America. Being a slave in Rome was more like today's social classes than what we think of as racial-based slavery as practiced in the Transatlantic Slave Trade and afterwards up to the Civil War period. There's one other interesting point in this part of the video that he somewhat glosses over. He states that because they could not import slaves in North America after a certain point in time, they had to breed them. This was a very clean way of getting over the practice of obvious eugenics. Also the fact that people were literally choosing people and then forcing them to have sex together with each other, which kind of sounds like rape. Or glossing over the fact that many people did rape their slaves in order to produce more slaves. Yes, it wasn't a fringe faction, it did happen quite often. If you would like evidence of that, I suggest you read the autobiography of any former slave. I'll get you started here with Frederick Douglass. My father was a white man. He was admitted to be such by all I ever heard speak of my parentage. The opinion was also whispered that my master was my father. But of this correctness of this opinion, I know nothing. I'm not saying that sexual abuse didn't happen under Roman slavery. I'm saying there was a clear incentive to do it, and not only that, there was the added, uncomfortableness of it being your own children, who then maybe you would have children and have them own your own children who you produced, by rape, incestual rape.
Let's look at another part of the world, in the same continent, in Africa, after the end of the transatlantic slave trade. Let's look for a moment now, instead of looking at West Africa and the Atlantic, let's look at East Africa.
And now he finally gets to his second and only other piece of actual concrete evidence that he will use.
Here is Africa's other slave trade, one that didn't really get going until the transatlantic slave trade ended, which obviously the British put an end to. East African slave trade was operated almost entirely by Africans themselves, and they did it to feed the Arab slave trade market. There was an inexhaustible demand for slaves in the Arab countries in the 19th century. It's been estimated that 100,000 slaves a year were exported from East Africa to the Middle East and Zanzibar, which would mean that, 100,000 a year, 1 million in 10 years, that would mean over the course of the 19th century we're talking about something like 10 million slaves, which is comparable with the number in the transatlantic slave trade.
There you got it. More math, proving all slavery was exactly equivalent.
Of course, at one time, this sort of thing was widely known in Britain. I mean, children used to read books mentioning this slave trade. Here's a later book about Dr. David Livingstone. That mentions his fight against the black slave trade in Africa, the East African slave trade.
Yes, back to conspiracies. Of course, of course. I find it quite interesting that he brings Dr. Livingstone into this. Somebody who was an avid follower of Adam Smith and his invisible hand. Maybe we should read some of what Dr. Livingstone himself said on what he thought was the root cause of the Arabic slave trade. In talking with my companions over these matters, the idea was suggested that if the slave market were supplied with articles of European manufacture by legitimate commerce, the trade in slaves would become impossible. It seemed more feasible to give the goods, for which the people now part with their servants in exchange for ivory and other products of the country, and thus prevent the trade at the beginning, than try to put a stop to it at any of the subsequent steps. This could only be effected by establishing a highway from the coast into the center of the country. Like Adam Smith, Livingstone firmly believed that the only way to stop the slave trade was economically, to make it economically unfeasible, and to do this, Africa needed to build its own independent economy.
It's funny when people are talking about decolonizing things and the wicked legacy of European colonialism. I wonder if they ever ask themselves how it is that so many millions of people in East Africa speak a language that was once known as Coast Arabic. I'm talking about Kiswahili.
And now maybe we can guess at where these hints of conspiracy are leading. It's the Arabs.
Probably they don't, because it's not the sort of colonialism that it's fashionable to think of. But of course the Arabs colonised Zanzibar a long, long time ago.
Or is it because people just don't study that much history? Way to argue for world history and multiculturalism yet again.
It's what I said about the three-card trick. Wherever you look in recorded history, you're going to see slavery anywhere in the world at any time up until the very 20th century.
Yes, just like how you told us that slavery was universal in California, right? Just because an immoral thing happens a lot does not mean it is any less immoral.
By focusing or allowing our attention to be focused on the transatlantic slave trade, we miss out on other things. And that's why people, when they talk about the slave trade, refer to the triangular trade as the slave trade.
Way to argue for world history again. Okay. And then he just ends the video admonishing us to read more books, which, it honestly sounds like good advice for some people. So let's take a look at his argument one last time here. He's arguing to exonerate the transatlantic slave trade, that pointing out that slavery existed everywhere. Now, what is his point? Is his point that humanity is awful and we've done awful things forever? No, his point is that there must be a nefarious plot to make you pay attention to the transatlantic slave trade. Although he brings in evidence that is truthful, his argument is not truthful. Let's look at the transatlantic slave trade for a moment in the context of Western history. The transatlantic slave trade, especially for Americans, culminates in a major reason for the American Civil War. For example, my home state of Texas, in their Declaration of Secession, will mention slavery, especially Negro slavery, 21 times as a reason for secession. If we look at Stephen H. Ambrose, the Vice President of the Confederate States of America, and his so-called cornerstone speech, we can see that he makes it very clear what the Confederate stance on his so-called peculiar institution was. We can understand that this has a direct connection to things like Jim Crow, but it still has a contemporary effect today. We don't even need to look at extremely heated topics to show this. We could look at Lee Atwater's 1981 so-called Southern Strategy speech. Lee Atwater would also go on to contribute to George H.W. Bush's campaign. Just because slavery was universal and it was universally immoral does not exonerate one particular act of slavery out of the others. In fact, it kind of highlights the fact that we should be learning about this stuff. So you can see his entire argument hinges on you, the audience member, accepting his assumption that there's a nefarious plot to keep the transatlantic slavery front and center over other forms. If you truly believe that history is equally important, it would seem that argument is a great argument for multicultural and world history. It is only with that assumption of the nefarious conspiracy that one can get to where this person is arguing in this video. So that's this video I wanted to make. It ended up being a lot longer than I initially assumed, but there was a lot of things here to go over, and we could probably make a ton of videos on any one of these topics. But anyway, I hope that this helps clear some things up. If you enjoyed this video or any of my other videos, please feel free to like and subscribe, and we'll see you next time.